Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session on the role of after school in championing safe childhoods. It's hard for me to say. Welcome and thank you for being here. My name is Lindsay, and I'm the director of the North Dakota Child Sexual Abuse Prevention Task Force, and I work at Families Flourish ND, formerly known as Prevent Child Abuse North Dakota. First, I want to thank you for being here this afternoon. I feel honored to share this time in this space with you, and I look forward to the next 90 minutes we have together. So let's chat quickly about our agenda for the next 90 minutes. So the first half of our session today is dedicated to the issue of child sexual abuse, from what it is to what the risk factors are, who the abusers are, and much more, including grooming and sexual behaviors in children. And then the second half of our session, which is my favorite half, is dedicated to prevention. What are the things we can do each and every day to ensure child safety? Before we get started, I'll take a minute to introduce myself. So again, my name is Lindsay, and I'm from Great Bend, North Dakota. I live just outside of Wahpeton, which is a town more people may be familiar with. My background is in early childhood education. I love working with young children. My career has been dedicated to serving others. I've worked in Head Start. I've worked with newly resettled refugee population at Lutheran Social Services of North Dakota. I've worked for the Clay County Attorney's Office doing victim services, and also have spent time again in Head Start. My career kind of started with Head Start and up until now, prior to working with Families Flourish ND, again worked in Head Start for a few years. So Head Start holds a very close place to my heart. I've been with Prevent Child Abuse North Dakota, again, now called Families Flourish ND, for the last 3 years, working as the director of the task force. I'm deeply committed to the issue of child sexual abuse prevention for many reasons. I'm a mama to 4 little girls. I'm an active volunteer with Bio Girls. This is my 4th season of being a mentor. And I'm an ordained minister, and I've officiated 3 weddings, the first of which I married my sister and her husband, Seth. So that was really exciting. I dedicate myself to this work not only to build a brighter future for children across North Dakota, including my own, but also because I'm deeply driven by the survivors I cherish and love in my life. My heart goes out to all survivors. There are an estimated 42 million adult survivors of child sexual abuse across the United States today. The information I'll be sharing in the next few slides can be difficult to hear and potentially triggering, whether it affects you in a personal way or not. If you need to take a break from this session, please feel free to do so. By educating ourselves, we are becoming a powerful force in creating a safer North Dakota for our children. Before we get started, we need to talk about the harsh realities of child sexual abuse. It's important to begin our session by acknowledging the gravity of the issue. To effectively prevent child sexual abuse, we must accept that it can happen to any child, including the children that we love. And again, I'll probably say this a couple times, but by participating today, we are contributing to a safer North Dakota, a powerful movement towards creating safer communities for our kiddos. So the North Dakota Child Sexual Abuse Prevention Task Force defines child sexual abuse as any interaction between a child and another person in which the child is used for sexual behaviors and activities through contact or non-contact behaviors. So this definition was recently revised because we initially did not cover what non-contact behaviors were in our original definition. And we felt like it was really important to add that. So non-contact abuse involves activities where there's no physical contact. Non-contact behaviors can include things like voyeurism, exhibitionism, or exposing a child to pornography is another example. Voyeurism would be someone who looks at a child's naked body for pleasure, and exhibitionism is showing one's genitals or exposing oneself to a child. In our definition, we also reference a child. And so when we're referring to a child, we're referring to an individual under the age of 18 years old. And in our definition, we also reference person. And when we're discussing a person, we're not just saying an adult, we're also referencing it, that it could be a child as well. So what's the prevalence of child sexual abuse in North Dakota? So 1 in every 10 North Dakota children will be a victim of child sexual abuse by their 18th birthday. These numbers likely underestimate the true scope of the problem, however. Studies suggest that as many as 33% of children never tell anyone that they were abused. And that's a heavy secret to carry for an entire lifetime. In one study, the average age of disclosure of child sexual abuse was 52 years old. And so questions that come up when we're talking about the prevalence is, why don't children tell? And what we know is that there's a multitude of reasons of why a child might not tell. So it could be because victims feel confused, shame, embarrassed. They might have a fear of getting in trouble, a conflicted feeling of loyalty to an abusing relative, coach, or friend of the family. It could be that they're worried about being loved less, shunned, or labeled. One of the things that I didn't think about a whole lot until the last few years, probably the last year after talking with survivors, was that they might not realize what's happening to them is wrong. One survivor shared with me that she didn't know until she was 12 years old what was happening to her was wrong. Children can worry that they may be taken away from the home. They might worry that they'll destroy their family. And what we also know is that abusers may threaten to physically harm a child if they tell. Harm the child, harm someone the child loves, even harm their family pet. One thing that's really helpful to learn more about is risk and protective factors. What we know is that no child is immune, but there are specific child and family characteristics that can either significantly heighten or lower the risk of sexual abuse. And so the following factors that I'm going to share with you are based on reported and identified cases of abuse. So family structure is the most important risk factor in child sexual abuse. Children who live with two married biological parents are at a lower risk of being abused. Children living without either parent, so a child perhaps living in foster care, those children are 10 times more likely to be sexually abused than children that live with both of those biological parents. And then children who live with a single parent that has a live-in partner are at the highest risk. Those children are 20 times more likely to be victims of child sexual abuse than children living with both biological parents. Another risk factor is gender. So females are 5 times more likely to be abused than males based on research. Another significant factor is age. While there's risk of children of all ages, children are most vulnerable between the ages of 7 and 13 years old. Race and ethnicity are an important factor in identified cases of sexual abuse as well. African American children have almost twice the risk of sexual abuse than white children. Children of Hispanic ethnicity have a slightly higher risk than non-Hispanic white children. And then what about our Indigenous communities? So child sexual abuse is one of the most devastating issues facing our Indigenous communities. Unfortunately, there is a significant lack of comprehensive data on the extent of the problem. Some researchers estimate that the prevalence could be as high as 1 in every 2 children. Lastly, the last risk factor I'll share is that children in low socioeconomic status households are 3 times as likely to be identified as a victim of child abuse. Abusers report that they look for passive, quiet, troubled, and lonely children from single parent or broken homes. The one thing I want to emphasize is that these are simply risk factors. It does not mean that a child living with any of those risk factors will for certain be a victim of child sexual abuse. As I mentioned previously, no child is immune. So just like there are risk factors, there are protective factors, and protective factors may lessen the likelihood of a child being abused. So there are individual child protective factors, and we'll start with those. So children who have caregivers that create safe, positive relationships with children, is a protective factor. A child who has caregivers who practice nurturing parenting skills and provide emotional support is a protective factor. A child who has caregivers who can meet their basic needs like food, shelter, education, and health services is a protective factor. Now we'll talk through some family protective factors. So, a child who lives in a family with strong social support networks and stable, positive relationships with the people around them is a protective factor. Children who live in families where caregivers are present and interested in the child is a protective factor. Children who live in families where their caregivers enforce household rules and engage in child monitoring is a protective factor. And the last one that I'm going to share is that children who live in families with caring adults outside the family who can serve as role models and mentors is a protective factor. So far in our time together, we've already discussed what child sexual abuse is. We've talked about the prevalence across the state of North Dakota. And now we just wrapped up risk and protective factors. So now we're going to talk about who most oftentimes the abuser is. Some of us grew up worried about strangers, like the term stranger danger. And I know for me, it likely had to do with the abductions that had occurred around the time I was growing up. And the ones that stand out to me, even still as an adult, are the Adam Walsh and Jacob Wetterling. Those were cases that were just all over the news and the media as I was growing up. But what we know is that stranger danger is not an effective child sexual abuse prevention education method, because when it comes to child sexual abuse, research shows that the greatest risk to children does not come from strangers. 90% of children are sexually abused by someone they know. And you can break that statistic down even more. So 60% are abused by someone the family knows and trusts, and then 30% of children are abused by family members. Additionally, children being sexually abused by older or more powerful children, it used to account for a staggering 40% of abuse. But a recent study from 2022 suggests that that number has now increased to 70%. There was a recent research study from 2022 conducted by Dr. David Finkelhor. He's the director of the Crimes Against Children Research Center in New Hampshire. In that study, they surveyed around 12,000 child and youth victims. And in that study, while they were surveying those victims, they found that as many as 70% of children, or the respondents to that survey, who were abused were sexually abused by other children. As adults, it's vital that we understand what healthy sexual development looks like, because then we can identify early on sexual behaviors that are problematic and potentially abusive, and we can intervene early. What we know about those who abuse children, in many cases, those people are friendly, likable people looking and acting just like everyone else. Abusers often form relationships with potential victims and their families prior to the abuse. They do that through a process called grooming. And we're going to talk more about grooming shortly, but before we do that, knowing that anywhere from 40 to 70% of children who are sexually abused by older or more powerful children, we're going to take a few minutes to talk about children's sexual development. So it's important to understand healthy sexual development in children, as it plays a key role in sexual abuse prevention. Adults are not typically taught what to expect as children develop sexually. For example, I went to school for early childhood education, and I learned a lot about other forms of development, whether that was their social emotional development or their cognitive development. But truly, I didn't learn a lot as far as sexual development in children. Sexuality is a normal part of life, even for babies and young children. Like other aspects of development, like motor skills or emotional intelligence, sexual behavior is healthy, it's expected, and it tends to follow a typical trajectory in childhood. So for us as caregivers, it's important to learn about typical sexual development in children because it provides us an opportunity to understand what normal development is and what may be a cause for concern. So first, we're going to start by talking about healthy sexual development. So when children are engaged in healthy sexual exploration, it is consensual and voluntary. Both children agree to the interaction without any pressure. It typically occurs between children who play together often. Children involved are typically close in age and physical development. These interactions are more exploratory in nature. It's more about curiosity and learning rather than sexual intent. Healthy sexual exploration also is interactions that are not forceful, they're not hurtful or aggressive. And these interactions are easily redirected. Children can be easily distracted or redirected to other activities. These interactions would be infrequent, unplanned, and spontaneous. And I have a graphic to share with you. This is a helpful resource that I would recommend as it breaks down stages of sexual development, starting all the way from the time a child is born all the way up through 18 years old. And so these are behaviors that are normal, age appropriate, spontaneous, easily redirected. One of the things that I have found really important for me, myself, to learn about is some of the driving factors on why children exhibit concerning sexual behaviors. I have found it really helpful to learn about those, and I wanted to share that with you guys today. So I've had the wonderful opportunity to learn from amazing leaders in the field who work with youth who display concerning sexual behaviors. And both of them have indicated that research and professional consensus suggests that there are 4 factors that may drive a child to engage in concerning sexual behaviors. And those are those 4 boxes you'll see on screen. So family adversity, exposure to aggression or coercive control, exposure to sexuality, and then specific individual child characteristics. And we're going to talk through these. So exposure to sexuality. That could be that a child has been sexually abused. It could be that the child witnesses others engaged in sexual behaviors and activities. They could have an exposure to sexualized media like pornography. It could also be that they live in a home where there's increased family sexuality. So they have very open attitudes towards sex, nudity, privacy. They maybe model sexualized behaviors in the home, things like that. One of the cases that stands out to me is when I worked for the county attorney's office, we had a child who had sexually abused another child. It was like a neighbor. And as the case progressed, we learned that this child, he lived in a home with a father who had an addiction to pornography. So that was something that was kind of consistently played in their home. So he had that exposure to it. So sometimes when I think about this, it resonates with me because of some of the cases I had seen. So before we move on to another category, I like to stop here and talk a little deeper about the topic of pornography. So I've had the opportunities to take several different trainings around the issue of pornography. One in particular that stands out to me was a training called Growing Up in a Porn Culture. In this training, they talked about, based on the research that they had done, the first exposure to pornography was between 8 and 11 years old. And what we know about pornography is it's shaping our children's sexual template. And what they're seeing is things that are violent and degrading, and they promote really unhealthy ideas about sex, relationships, and gender. And we know that our children are having this exposure. So we have to acknowledge and recognize that it's impacting their brains and it's impacting our children that are having this exposure. So the impact on boys being exposed to pornography is that they have higher rates of depression and anxiety. They have an increased vulnerability to sexual abuse. They're more likely to participate in risky sexual behaviors. One of the ones that scares me the most is that they have a lower capacity for empathy. And what we also know is that boys who are exposed to pornography are sexualizing young girls ages 4 to 7 years old at an increasing rate. We know that there's impacts on our girls who are watching pornography or having this exposure as well. So what we know is that there are increased rates of anxiety and depression, increased vulnerability to sexual assault, increased rates of self-harm, and an increase in feelings of self-hatred. So it's something that we need to be aware of and we need to be talking with children about. And I know that can be really hard to think about. The first time I tried to talk with my daughter about pornography was probably a year ago. She was probably about 8. Just based on the rates of children's exposure, I knew that I needed to start having that conversation. And it's uncomfortable and it was hard. And I work in this field every single day and it was hard. So I acknowledge that these are difficult conversations to have. So if you're a parent and a caregiver, and I want you to know that you're not alone and there's no easy way to have some of these conversations. My daughter was it was tough and I muddled my way through it because I didn't have a script and I didn't know what I was going to say exactly. But the one thing I feel good about is that I've started the conversation and I've opened the door. And so, although we keep a pretty close eye on the things that our children are being exposed to at home, when she's riding the school bus, I don't know what exposure she could have or if she's at a friend's house. But if she does come across something, I'm hoping she goes, oh yeah, this is what my mom was talking to me about. I know what this is. And I think that's really powerful. And I think it's a really good step in educating our children and having these conversations that are sometimes hard and uncomfortable. So from there, let's move on to another factor that may drive a child to engage in concerning sexual behaviors. Let's talk about individual child characteristics. So children with sexual behavior challenges often exhibit other challenging behaviors oh my goodness, excuse me, challenges often exhibit other challenging behaviors and social difficulties, such as a lack of impulse control. Maybe they have a difficulty following the rules. It could be children who have difficulty initiating play with others, difficulty making friends, perhaps limited self-regulation skills. The next one we're going to jump over to is family adversity. And that can be any factor that adversely impacts the caregiver's ability to provide safety, supervision, guidance, and behavior management. And this could be due to many things. It could be because of poverty, minimal family support, limited educational opportunities. It could be because of trauma. And then the last one is exposure to aggression or coercive control. And that could be a child that is living in a home with harsh physical discipline. Maybe they have an exposure to domestic or interpersonal violence. It could be exposure to violence, even through like video games or community violence, things like that. So the driving factors could be from one of those categories, or it could be from any mix of those categories. But again, just because a child has this exposure or they have an individual child characteristic, like I mentioned, it does not mean that the child will engage in concerning sexual behaviors. Again, it's kind of like a risk factor again. A child may exhibit those behaviors if they're in one of these categories or exposed to one of these categories. Research suggests that children exposed to one of these have a higher risk of displaying concerning sexual behaviors. And I always like to give people an opportunity to think about that and ponder that for a second. And I'll repeat what I just said. So research suggests that children exposed to one of these 4 categories have a higher risk of displaying concerning sexual behaviors. A lot of times, one of the top guessed ones is exposure to sexuality. And honestly, like if I had to guess, that would probably be where my brain would go too. But it is exposure to aggression or coercive control. Children who are exposed to aggression or that coercive control have a higher risk of displaying concerning sexual behaviors. So now let's talk about what those concerning sexual behaviors look like in children. And I won't read through all of these, but any sexual behavior that involves force, threats, coercion is concerning. This includes making another child participate in sexual activities against their will. It can be age inappropriate knowledge, displaying sexual knowledge or behaviors that's not typical for their age group, such as more explicit sexual acts or language. Anytime there's sexual behavior involving animals, that's concerning. Um, Engaging in sexual behaviors frequently or compulsively, especially if it disrupts like their normal daily activities or causes distress to that child or other children. Um, and this would be a behavior that is unresponsive to redirection. And as much as you would try to redirect them, get them to play in another area of the classroom, um, they're just persistent, and these behaviors do not stop despite attempts to redirect the child to other activities. When we see concerning sexual behaviors, we need to intervene and we need to be vigilant in monitoring the child with those behaviors. And we're going to talk in the next couple slides about what does or how should we respond? What's a good way for us to respond in those situations? What I like to, when I'm thinking about sexual behaviors in children, you can think of like a stoplight, or in three different categories. So we have the healthy or normal category, which is the green. We have the cautionary, which are those yellow. They're a little bit further away from the norm. And then we have those red behaviors, which are the behaviors we just talked about, the concerning sexual behaviors. So the stoplight is a nice visual to help you when you're reflecting on various behaviors. And now we're going to break them down and discuss how we as adults can respond appropriately. So as mentioned earlier, the green behaviors are the healthy behaviors. These are normal, they're age appropriate, they're spontaneous, mutual, lighthearted, easy to redirect. The tone that you would use in these situations is guidance. It's not shaming, blaming, or punitive. But just because a behavior is typical, it doesn't mean that we should just ignore the behavior. Often, when children participate in sexual behaviors, it indicates that they need to learn something. And so, in those situations, you would teach the child what they need to know given the situation. And if you're like me, examples are helpful, especially when learning something new. So, an example could include if you work like in a preschool age classroom and you're out on the playground and you hear a bunch of kiddos giggling in like a fort or like a toy house. So you peek in the toy house and you find them sitting on the ground with their underwear off, pointing at and laughing at each other's genitals. In this case, you might teach the children that it's okay to be curious about other people's bodies, but that private parts should be kept private, even with our friends. And again, you're using a non-shaming tone, and then you redirect them to a new activity. There's a couple examples on the screen of ways to respond if you see some of those more normal behaviors, like a child, touching or holding their genitals. That's a pretty normal behavior, and you might say, "Oh, that's a private behavior, and this is not a private place." Again, we're not shaming the child or making them feel bad about their body. We're just redirecting them and using a calm, even tone voice. More normal things would be a child who's curious about other children's genitals. It could be a child that's interested in their body parts and the functions. And some of the other responses you'll see on screen is if you have questions about your body, you can ask me. Or another one is your sister or your friend needs privacy. When they're changing their clothes, you can wait outside her door until she's dressed. In these categories or these behaviors provide opportunities to talk, explain, and support children. Now we're going to move into the behaviors that are outside normal behavior in terms of like persistence, frequency. It could be inequality in age, power, or ability. These behaviors signal the need to monitor and provide extra support. And I can share some examples again, because that's always what I find the most helpful. So it could be a child who continues to follow others into private spaces like the bathroom, or I guess at school, that'd probably be the most common one, like following a child into the bathroom to look at them or to try touch them. It could be a child who's pulling other children's pants down or their skirt up against their will. It could be persistent questions about sexuality despite you having answered them. So these are a little bit further away from the norm, and we need to be vigilant in monitoring and supervising these children. So in these situations, you would confront the behavior and then prohibit the behavior. So an example could be, I'm concerned because I see you following so-and-so into the bathroom after we discussed it. You need to stop doing that. And then redirect. The thing about yellow behaviors is that they can either diminish or they can escalate in the future. So that's why monitoring is so important. Adult interventions in this area we should communicate in direct language, using again that non-shaming tone, fostering empathy and responsibility, and then just again continue to monitor the child. All right, and now we're going to talk about how can we respond if we are seeing some of those concerning behaviors. What I would say to that, if you're seeing any of those concerning behaviors that we've talked about, we need to refer for appropriate support for that child. Because I know for me that it is beyond my scope of practice to provide mental health services for children who present with sexual behavior challenges. In my role, it's important for me to know what intervention options for sexual behavior challenges are available to children and families in my community. We should be prepared to report anytime someone has a concern about a child's sexual behavior. And if it falls under the concerning behaviors we've covered today, we would encourage reporting, and then intake will screen the report from there. And filing a report can be scary, but it can also be the first step to accessing supportive services for that child. And I think how I would like to end and kind of wrap up our session here is that it's crucial to handle such situations with care and compassion. And remember that children who display sexual behaviors are simply children, and we just need to respond appropriately. I would say the biggest thing that pops into my mind is just not shaming children. We don't want them to start to think their body is bad or their body is dirty. We simply need to provide them with language, redirecting them. And again, if we don't know how to respond and it's beyond our scope of practice, like some of those red behaviors that we talked about a few slides ago, and I'm going to pull those up again. We need to be able to refer for appropriate support. If you ever have questions, I am happy to help. Sometimes I'll have a training and someone will ask, like, Lindsay, what do I do in this situation? And in that setting, it's really hard because there's so many questions I have about the age of the child, how long the behavior's been happening, what happened before the behavior got to that point, how have you been responding, things like that. So if something comes up at any time and you're just trying to process through and figure out the best way to respond, I'm happy to be a support, and you can reach out to me. I'll share my contact information at the end of the session today, so you can have that. But what I would say, wherever you are on your path of learning, it's important that you have factual information, because awareness helps destigmatize sexual behaviors in children, and it allows adults to better support healthy development. So as we close out this section, I'm going to leave you with a couple of research-based facts. Many children demonstrate sexual behavior in peer settings. It's very normal. Children with those concerning, problematic sexual behaviors have not always been sexually abused. And that can be a really damaging myth. And I've heard it a lot. People will say that, well, if they're doing it to someone else, they've had it done to them. Um, but the statistic is only about 10% of those who sexually abuse children have been sexually abused themselves. That is a very damaging myth. And I just want to share that because as someone who loves survivors, it's really hard to hear that, oh, I got, if they're doing that to a child, they've had it done to them. Um, Only 10% of those who have sexually abused children have been abused themselves. Children with sexual behavior problems are not younger versions of adult sex offenders. And then the last one I'd like to leave you with is that most children who receive treatment for sexual behavior do not continue the behavior into adolescence or adulthood. Recidivism rates are very, very low. All right, we're going to quickly talk through grooming and red flag behaviors. Many of you have probably heard the word grooming before, and we're just going to talk more about what that is, and then we'll talk through some of those red flag behaviors. So grooming is a common strategy for those who sexually abuse children. The thing that's tricky about grooming is that it typically looks innocent. The identification of red flag grooming behaviors can help in the prevention and detection of child sexual abuse. So it's important that we have these conversations and we talk about these grooming and red flag behaviors. So grooming is manipulative behavior an abuser uses to gain access to a potential victim, coerce them to agree to the abuse, and reduce the risk of being caught. Grooming can happen over short or prolonged periods of time, from weeks, months, to even years. It can happen online or in person. In some instances, the parent or family is being groomed as well, which often could look like a level of generosity that's probably too good to be true. It could be things like free babysitting, an excessive willingness to help out, even financial assistance. The grooming process itself is often misleading because the abuser could be someone well known or highly regarded in the community, and as a result, it's easier to trust them. But again, fortunately, the good thing for us is that we can learn to recognize grooming behaviors by tuning into what we would consider to be red flag behaviors. And we're going to talk through some of those next. So red flag behaviors can include a person who seeks to have one-on-one time alone with your child, maybe taking your child or a child on special outings, giving one specific child lots of attention. It could be someone who gives one specific child special treatment. They may allow that one child to break the rules. Gift giving, a person who buys gifts or special treats for no apparent reason. Could be a person who's very touchy with the child, and that could occur in front of trusted adults, trying to normalize the touch. So I know for me and people I've had this session with before is that, wait a second, like looking at some of those behaviors on screen, that sounds like something someone who loves my child would do. Right? Like I think about my mom in this situation a lot because she comes to my house all the time with gifts for my daughters for no apparent reason. But my mom doesn't give those gifts to just Elise, my oldest, right? Or she doesn't just want to take Elise on a special outing. So what I would say is that if you're wondering, like, how can I tell the difference between someone who's genuinely loves and cares about my child and someone who's perhaps trying to gain access to abuse them, is I would say if a person notices the behaviors on screen in a pattern and a person is seeking more of that one-on-one alone access with a child. And then lastly, if your gut is telling you something is off, I would limit the child's interaction or ensure it was always supervised with that specific individual. Another important thing to consider is that if the child's behavior begins to change around that specific person, it's also a red flag. I know that was quick, but as we wrap up this section on grooming, I want to emphasize that it's important to exercise caution when you see adults giving an unusual amount of attention to a specific child, touching them unnecessarily. While we know that not every kind neighbor or doting family friend is a child abuser, we should be alert to the possibility. Remember the statistics. 1 in 10 children in North Dakota will be a victim by their 18th birthday of child sexual abuse. And 90% of children are abused by someone they know. I have the extreme honor of working with survivors and parents of child victims. And I've heard from several individuals that they had the ability to recognize grooming and red flag behaviors after the abuse had occurred. They could look back and they could say, oh my gosh, I didn't know it then, but they would they would take her to get ice cream, or he was so interested in her. He was like a grandfather to her. He let her come over, and um, I've heard the stories over and over and over again that they were able to pinpoint those red flag behaviors after the abuse had occurred, and that's called hindsight bias. So the more that we understand grooming and the more we can identify red flag behaviors, potentially we can prevent abuse from happening. We're going to talk now about the signs of sexual abuse. When we first started today, we defined what child sexual abuse is according to the North Dakota Child Sexual Abuse Prevention Task Force. And what we talked about is that child sexual abuse doesn't always include physical contact. In fact, physical signs of sexual abuse are less common. Physical signs, however, may include things like genital irritation, bruising, redness, rash, swelling, infections, and those should be investigated immediately. Indirect physical signs could include chronic headaches or stomach aches with no medical cause. And it's theorized that that's due to the anxiety that a child might be feeling around what's happening. What you're seeing on screen are those more common behaviors, and those are emotional and behavioral signs. And that could be a child who is with overtly compliant behavior, too perfect behavior. It could be a regression of outgrown behavior, such as thumb sucking or bedwetting, a child that stopped sucking their thumb, started sucking their thumb again. It could be unusual fear of certain people or places. Maybe they have a reluctance to be alone with a certain person or going to a certain place. It could be nightmares, night terrors, other sleep disturbances, a shift in their disposition or their mood. It could be towards family, friends, pets. Something's changing. And then self-harm, such as biting self, scratching self, pulling out hair, cutting. Could also include things that aren't on screen, like changes in eating habits. It could be overeating or stealing food, attempts to run away, thinking of themselves or their body as bad or dirty. And the one that stands out to me the most is the one on the top left, the too perfect behavior. I'm a trained facilitator of a training called Darkness to Light. And in that training, before they redid it, it's a little different now than it used to be. But in that session, they have survivors speaking. And the one survivor, she talked about how she became like a straight A student in school and she began to excel at sports. She went on to get a gold medal in the Olympics, and she talked about that she felt like the only place that she had any control over her life was at what was happening at school and in her sports. So that one always stands out to me because it's not always what I would think of as an emotional or behavioral sign of sexual abuse. Emotional or behavioral signs are more likely, but it may also be symptoms of other trauma in a child's life, such as physical abuse, neglect. Maybe parents are going through a divorce or separation, or a child's being bullied. There's lots of reasons why you could see the signs listed on the screen. It's also important to keep in mind that some children might exhibit no signs whatsoever. What I would say is that if you notice a child in your life who is showing any of these signs listed above, stay curious, ask them questions, be aware of what's going on in their life and where they're spending their time, both in the physical world that we're in and the virtual world as well. If a child does disclose, don't panic, remain calm. Give the child your full attention to demonstrate that you're listening carefully and you're taking the information seriously. Let the child take their time, go at their own pace, use their own words. Reassure the child that they did the right thing by telling someone and that they were so brave in doing so. Assure the child that it's not their fault and you're going to do your best to help. And let them know that you do need to tell someone else. And then there's some don'ts. Don't make promises you can't keep. Like, oh, I'll make sure you're never going to have to be around so and so again because we can't promise that. And then also don't approach the individual accused as well. If you have questions about reporting, you can go to the North Dakota Department of Health and Human Services to find the intake number to make that report. Now, before we start to talk about prevention, we're going to close with talking about long-term consequences. So most child sexual abuse survivors experience psychosocial losses resulting from their traumas. And these losses include like a loss of childhood, loss of innocence, loss of faith in God or hope in a higher power, loss of family relationships, loss of self-esteem, loss of personal power, loss of self, and lastly, the loss of ability to feel joy in life. So substance abuse are common consequences for adult survivors of sexual abuse. Mental health problems are a common consequence of child sexual abuse cases. Obesity and eating disorders are common in women who have a history of child sexual abuse, more common in women. Child sexual abuse is also associated with physical health problems in adulthood, and it's theorized that this is a consequence of the substance abuse, mental health issues, and other consequences that survivors of child sexual abuse face. And then adult survivors of CSA are more likely to become involved in crime, both as a perpetrator and as a victim. People who experience child sexual abuse tells us that it affects their entire life, and research backs them up. In the words of one survivor that I have had the honor of working with and knowing and caring for, she said, it's like a dark cloud that's followed me my entire life. But I don't like to stop there. It's important to acknowledge that child sexual abuse does not necessarily sentence a victim to an impaired life. Often people who find healing, maybe they find treatment or the support that they need, they go on to live their best lives. We get to talk about my favorite part now, prevention. We're going to start first with chatting about healthy boundaries. And we're going to kick off this section by discussing body awareness and autonomy. These elements are crucial pieces of prevention. By fostering body awareness and autonomy, we can better protect children from situations that might compromise their well-being, like child sexual abuse. Together, these concepts help children develop confidence, communicate their needs, and protect themselves from potential harm. By fostering these skills, we support their overall well-being and their healthy development. So first, we're going to talk about body awareness. Body awareness is the understanding and recognition of one's own body, their body parts, including its position, their movement, and sensations. Teaching body awareness to children is crucial for several reasons, like you'll see on screen. Let's start with empowerment. It helps children understand their bodies and feel confident in them and in discussing them as well. This knowledge empowers them to take control of their personal space and boundaries. Next, let's jump over to safety. By understanding the concept of private parts and boundaries, children are better equipped to recognize and report inappropriate behavior. This can be a key factor in preventing child sexual abuse. Now, let's talk about communication. When children know the correct terms for their body parts, they can communicate more effectively about their health and any concerns that they might have. Self-esteem. Body awareness can contribute to a positive self-image and self-esteem. Children who understand and respect their bodies are more likely to develop a healthy sense of self-worth. We want that for all of our children. And then lastly, respect for others. Learning about their own bodies and boundaries helps children understand and respect the boundaries of others, fostering respectful interactions. There's lots of ways to teach body awareness. Some could include incorporating activities, um, using their hands, legs, trunk, hands, fingers, feet, even their toes, incorporating heavy work like pushing, pulling, carrying, stomping, and jumping. Show children what they can do with their bodies. Or if you want to identify body parts, there's lots of great body awareness activities that we can be doing with children. Now let's talk about autonomy. This is one of my favorite conversations to have. Children who are taught about body autonomy can better recognize when someone is violating their boundaries. This awareness helps them identify and report inappropriate behavior. Children who understand their autonomy are less likely to be manipulated or groomed by potential abusers. They're more likely to resist and report grooming behaviors as well. So how can we promote autonomy in our children? Well, we can encourage decision making, we can teach boundaries, and we can model respect for autonomy. So allow children to make choices in their daily activities, such as picking out their clothes, which as a mom to four girls, that can be really hard when those outfits get a little crazy. Letting a child choose their own snacks. Maybe there's some limits, all right? Maybe we need to have something healthy. It could be deciding which game to play. This helps them understand that their opinions and decisions matter when they're making those decisions, encouraging them to make those decisions, teaching boundaries. Explain the concept of personal space and boundaries. Use clear language to help them understand that certain parts of their body are private and that it's okay to say no to any unwanted touch, and reinforce that their body belongs to them. I am in charge of my body and I have the right to say no. Lastly, model respect for autonomy. Show respect for their autonomy by asking for their consent before touching them. Even in routine situations like helping them get dressed or giving them a hug, this demonstrates that their consent is important and should be respected. Empowering kids to understand and trust their own bodies is vital. Teaching children to recognize what feels right and what doesn't helps them develop a strong sense of self-awareness and confidence. It also plays a key role in their safety and well-being as they learn to set boundaries and communicate their needs effectively. So together, these elements, body awareness and autonomy, contribute to a child's overall sense of self and ability to navigate their environment confidently. And now we're going to talk about consent. And I love talking about consent too, and teaching consent to our children. At its core, consent is a concept that many learn as early as preschool and sometimes even younger. The notion that we should respect one another's boundaries in order to stay safe and build healthy relationships. Teaching children about consent can help keep them safe from abusers, but it can also be about simpler things, like whether they want to play a game or get a hug from someone, laying the groundwork for an understanding of sexual relationships much later on, as well as ensuring safer environments for our children in the present, like at school or on the school bus. So how can we practice and honor consent? Ask for permission before touching children and encourage them to do the same. Do this by modeling it yourself. Before you reach out for a hug from your child or your niece or your nephew or a child in your care, a grandchild, ask permission to do so first. And we practice consent at our house, and we have for a few years. And we encourage our children to do the same with each other and with us too. So we try to model it. Our youngest is just under 2 years old at our house, and her big sisters constantly want to hold her, picking her up. And it's really easy to see when she doesn't want that attention because she'll yell at them or cry. And we point that out to our bigger girls and we say things like, Charlotte's a person and she's showing you that she does not want to be picked up right now or that she doesn't want to be hugged right now. Ask her next time if she wants a hug or if she wants to be picked up, please. If the child is very young or nonverbal, get into the habit of communicating consent by simply letting them know what you're doing and why before touching. You can do simple explanations like, I'm going to button up your shirt so you're ready for school, or I'm going to put shampoo into your hair so that you're clean. It reinforces the concept that communication during touch is ongoing. Another thing to keep in mind, talk about consent outside of the context of sex. Many times the word consent is brought up in a sexual context only, but you can make consent a part of everyday conversations by using it to frame any permission seeking. Teaching kids to ask consent before borrowing other people's things. Before they're posting pictures online, I ask my daughter's consent before I post pictures of them. I'm just trying to get into that habit and making it normal for children. And always, always, always before touching other people, we should ask consent. I know I feel like I say all of this is my favorite, but this actually is my favorite also. So, body safety rules are essential for promoting personal safety in our children and empowering them to protect themselves. Don't get me wrong, the burden of prevention and protection must sit squarely on the shoulders of adults who are legally and morally responsible for the health and safety of children. But there are many adult survivors who have said if they would have only known from the first inappropriate touch that it was wrong, how different their lives might have been. There have been interviews with convicted sex offenders who have said things like, if I had any idea that the family was talking about it, that the child knew about it, I would have thought twice. There are a lot of people who believe that teaching children the rules of the body or body safety rules takes away a child's innocence, but I say it helps protect it. Um, these are simple yet empowering skills that can make all the difference to a child's life. And these are things that I do with my girls. Like I said, I have an almost 2-year-old and an almost 10-year-old, and then the in between, a 7 and 4-year-old. This is a little bit repetitive to what we've talked about so far, but bear with me because it's important. We're going to start with body autonomy again. I am in charge of my body. This means that we don't force children to give hugs or kisses, even if it's a close friend of the family. If they don't want to hug Mimi or Auntie, offer alternatives such as a hug or a high five or a handshake. Let the child choose what they prefer and respect their choice. If you're like me, I love my mother, but she'll pull the, oh, Mimi's gonna be sad if I don't get a hug. And just having open and honest conversations about what the adults in the child's life, about why we don't guilt our children and why we respect their choices. Teach and practice consent. We just talked about consent, and you can start early with consent. We just learned that understanding consent equips children with the knowledge to recognize inappropriate behavior and seek help if needed. It helps children identify situations where their boundaries might be violated. Teaching consent will help give the child the permission and the confidence to say no should someone touch them in a way that makes them feel uncomfortable. And your kids and children in your care, they'll pick up on the body safety rules pretty quickly. So we practice all of these at our house. And my little girl twirling in the blue dress on the left-hand side was really, really quick to point out to me that I didn't ask for consent the day that I brushed her hair out of her face and I was looking at her beautiful blue eyes and her freckles, and I gave her a kiss on her forehead. And she looked at me and said, Mommy, you didn't ask consent. And I said, You're right, I didn't. I'm so sorry. Thank you for reminding me. I want them to call me out if I mess up and if I violate their body safety rules. stop me and stop mommy, my little Emma in the white dress. She has the cutest giggle in the whole wide world, and I want to just tickle her because it's so darn cute. Um, and I was tickling her, and I was, you know, I I just couldn't stop myself. And I know that's not right because she said stop, but she was laughing, and but I kept going, and she just finally was like, stop me and stop, mommy. And it's like, oh, I know you're right. I'm so sorry, Emma. That darn giggle is so cute. But yeah, stop means stop. So our children can teach us and remind us of our body safety rules, and keep us in check. And I think that's good. And I want my kids to keep me in check, just like I want them to keep everybody in check when it comes to their body safety rules. Secrets versus surprises. So people who sexually abuse children depend on children to keep their secrets. Abusers will say things like, this is our secret, you can't tell anyone. And they may threaten to harm a child in a number of ways in an effort to keep them silent. And children who have not been educated about secrets often don't dare tell anyone. So, one of the things I would encourage people to steer clear of is using happy secrets or good secrets, because abusers are known to groom children for abuse by asking them to keep, well, this is just our happy secret or it's our good secret. But surprises are different. So we keep surprises instead, because a surprise is something that will eventually be shared, like a birthday party or a special gift for someone. Again, my kids keep me in line if I mess up. One day I was making supper, and that little girl twirling in the blue again was so hungry and she wanted a snack. And I was like, oh, we're going to have supper soon. And finally, I gave in and I was like, okay, you can have a fruit snack, but don't tell your sisters because I don't want everyone eating before supper. And she looked me dead in my eyes and she goes, Mom, we don't keep secrets. And I said, yep, you're right. We don't. And I should never have asked you to keep that secret. And sometimes, you know, 5 years ago, we probably didn't think it was fine to keep secrets. But with the education and the background I've had, we don't do that anymore. So she corrects me and she keeps me in line if I mess up. And I don't think I've ever messed that up again, because that's right. We don't keep secrets. If you can do one thing, please, 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 please teach anatomically correct names for private parts. This alone might help prevent child sexual abuse from happening in the first place, because in one study, researchers interviewed 91 convicted sex offenders, and many of them reported that they were less likely to target children who knew correct anatomical names for body parts because it increased their risk of getting caught. Other thing to know is that having correct terminology can help children disclose if abuse occurs. Tell your child matter-of-factly that no one should touch their private parts and that no one should ask them to touch somebody else's private parts. Caregivers will often forget that second part of the sentence. Sexual abuse often begins with an abuser asking the child to touch them or someone else. Tell your child, this is another one that caregivers don't think about saying, but tell children that no one should ever take pictures of their private parts either. Out of all of the body safety rules, that's the one my children remember the best. When I'm like, let's talk about our body safety rules, that's the first one they remember, which is good, but I want them to remember all of them. Which is why we revisit them a lot. So encourage privacy when children are using the bathroom, they're dressing or changing their clothes. Encourage that. You deserve privacy when you're going potty. You deserve privacy when you're taking a bath. One day, out of the blue, my daughter's school called, and at the time she was in preschool. And of course, I'm like, oh boy, is someone sick? You're the first thing you think when a child's school calls. But it was my daughter's teacher, and she said, something happened at school today and she wanted me to call you. And she said that when my child was going potty, one of her friends crawled playfully underneath the stall and crawled into her stall. And my little girl immediately went to a trusted adult, her teacher, and told her trusted adult that this is what happened and I need privacy when I'm going potty. And can you please call my mom and tell her what happened? And still to this day, that is probably one of my proudest moments when her teacher called me to tell me that. It was her friend, just being a little kid, but my daughter knew that she deserved privacy and private parts are private. So safe and unsafe touch versus good and bad. I still hear people using good and bad touch. Um, those are no longer appropriate descriptors of abuse because what we know is that the body is wired to feel good to touch. So harmful touches can feel physically good rather than bad or painful, which can be really confusing to kiddos. So what you can do instead is teach safe and unsafe touch. Safe touch is one that makes you feel comfortable, safe, loved, while an unsafe touch makes you feel uncomfortable. What I would say is start very early and use everyday events like teachable moments to start conversations. And today we don't talk through teachable moments, but if you ever see anything on TV or if you see something in the store, if it touches on your values, take it as an opportunity to use it as a teachable moment with your child or a child that you care for. The other thing I would like to emphasize is that these are not one-time conversations. They're ongoing, built into daily life, whether it's bath time to riding in the car, check-ins during dinner time. And when you're having these conversations with your child, you can use the same tone and attitude that you would when speaking to them about any topic, like any safety topic, like crossing the street or wearing a bike helmet. Most importantly, you can let your child know or a child in your care know that they can tell you anything at any time and you'll believe them and repeat that conversation as they grow. I always include this because I do think it's just eye-opening. We were at Christmas and my daughter Adeline had previously said, "Mommy, sometimes my underwear gets stuck in my vulva." And it's like, yeah, that can happen sometimes. And so we were at Christmas and I was telling my sister-in-law, oh, Adeline had said this, and she was shocked. She goes, "Oh, how does she know that word?" And it's, I was like, what do you mean? It's no different than her knowing her nose or her elbow. We really need to start being comfortable in using anatomically correct terms with our children. Right? That can prevent child sexual abuse in the first place. Here's a body safety rules poster that I put on the walls of my children's bedrooms, more so for me as a reminder to revisit them, but also for my girls to see. So what are everyday things that we can do to keep children safe? Well, first, we can start by minimizing opportunity. Most of the time, child sexual abuse occurs in one-on-one situations. More than 80% of cases happen in those isolated one-on-one situations when the child is alone with the abuser. What this tells us, though, is that we actually have power. So if we can eliminate or reduce one-on-one situations, we're actually going to reduce the risk of sexual abuse. It's important that we make interactions with children observable and interruptible, especially in like a childcare facility. That's not only for the safety of children, but also for us as staff working with children as well. To prevent child sexual abuse, we have to break through the stigma and the shame and talk about it. Talk about how it happens. Uncomfortable conversations are necessary. Build a safety network, build a network of trusted adults, which would be anywhere from 3 to 5 trusted adults. One should not be a family member, so it could be like a teacher at school. These are people that you intentionally choose to be a part of your team to keep the child in your life safe. These are individuals you can talk to about child sexual abuse, body safety rules, everything that we've talked about in this PowerPoint today. Children should know that their trusted adult will never, one, ask them to keep secrets, two, honor and respect their body safety rules, and three, always believe them. We should know the facts. If we don't understand child sexual abuse, we cannot end it. Understanding the facts about CSA can help us better protect children in our life. We talk through grooming and red flag behaviors. Grooming can be difficult to recognize because, like I said, it can look like normal caring behavior sometimes. But because it may not be, it's important to look for patterns of certain behaviors and intervene early, even if what you think you're seeing might be trivial. Monitor technology, stay curious. Offenders may use the internet to lure children into physical contact. So spend time with children when they're online. Be affirming about responsible digital use. Be involved in online activities they enjoy. Um, and one thing I would say is no screens in bedrooms. Now, pay attention to who children are spending time with. Be sure to talk with your child after they spend time with others, whether it's getting back from camp or from a babysitter's or from a friend's house. Ask them questions about what they did, how they spend their time together. Just stay curious. Did you play any new games? Things like that. Be proactive. If a child seems uncomfortable or resistant to being with or near a particular person, ask them why. Don't force a child to be with that individual. People who sexually abuse children are likely to run in a different direction if they see that the caregiver is involved and the child is educated. In the words of one abuser, he said, if I drive up to a bank and I see cop cars, I'm going to move on. I'll go down the street and I'll rob a different bank. I think a lot of us worry. I can speak for myself. A lot of us worry about offending a relative, sounding overprotective with a teacher or another parent. But we need to ask ourselves, am I willing to feel a little uncomfortable so my child or this child I care about doesn't have to? This information is absolutely not shared to cause alarm or panic. It's more so just to give everyone the tools they need to protect and empower children. We're just going to end with a couple of resources that I recommend. Um, so some of the books that I like to use at my house, there is a boys body book too, but we use the girls body book. It's Not the Stork is another really good book that I really enjoy because it actually has like anatomically correct drawings of body parts. So it's easy to talk about like the names of body parts that way. My Body Belongs to Me is a good one. Celebrate Your Body. Some more resources. Some are aimed more at children, some are for adults. We have the caregiver guide, which can be found at the website you'll get on the next slide. Some summer safety information, a crossword search, the healthy sexual development chart, coloring sheet. And then there's my information. So there's our website, the www.ndstopcsa.com, where you can find more of those resources that I just shared with you. And there's my email as well and my phone number. And that's everything. I finished